Hello and welcome to today's Finovate webinar. I'm David Penn, Research Analyst at Finovate. I'm joined on the line by Dan Lattimore, Senior Vice President at Celent, and Andrew Stevens, Banking and Financial Services Specialist at Quadient. Welcome all. Please know that in addition to our interactive Q&A, we're going to be live tweeting the webinar as well, so you can join in the conversation using the hashtag FinovateWebinar. Brands spend a lot of time, effort, and money ensuring that first impressions are strong enough to encourage customers to buy. Acquiring new customers is important to any business, but how do you make a good impression on someone you've never met? During this webinar, we will address the importance of building a relationship with current and potential customers and the importance of creating a self-service offering, all while helping your organization deliver an exceptional customer experience. Dan Lattimore, Senior Vice President with Celent, will discuss key elements to build a customer relationship both in the branch and digitally, and why the use of digital is essential to delivering an exceptional customer experience today. He'll discuss three key areas: how customers are actually interacting with their banks today, how banks are approaching their digital initiatives, and what banks can do better across channels to attract new customers and deepen new and existing relationships. Andrew Stevens, Banking and Financial Services Specialist with Quadient, will conclude our webinar with practical lessons on how to ensure your customer feels they are part of the banking relationship in the face of using digital channels. And again, let me remind you that we're going to be having an interactive Q&A, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please send them to us using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And with that, Dan, thank you. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks very much, David, and thanks, Andrew and Quadient. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about this notion of solving this digital dilemma and what customers want and how banks can help them get it. Let me just start out very quickly with giving you a quick overview of Celent and why it is we're even qualified to be talking to you about this. We're a research firm focused solely on financial services because today there is not a strategic decision that a bank makes that doesn't have a technology component. And as we look at that strategy-driven technological implementation, that's where we add value, both from teaching the business side about technology and teaching the tech side about strategy. Our clients are a mix of banks and financial services providers. We speak at conferences all over the world. We're quoted in the press all the time. And the foundation of what we do is research. And I'll share some of our research with you today in the context of this notion of the digital customer experience. So just to frame this, first of all, the notion of digital is really inextricably linked with that of omnichannel. And 4 years ago, we started to develop a framework for thinking about digital in banking. And for us, it's really this notion of delivering the customized but consistent FI brand experience, and it is an experience, customers across every channel and every point of interaction. And all those little touch points are what add up to, at the end of the day, the customer experience, which ends up then building a relationship. And even before a customer becomes a client of your bank, they still have got some idea of you. They've got to know you or have an impression of you before they even decide that they want to enter into a formal relationship. So that relationship building is starting even before they have opened up an account or taken out a loan or opened a credit card. Underpinning all this, and we're not going to spend tons of time on it today, but digital does depend heavily on analytics and on automation. And if you're going to do it right from an old heritage perspective, you've got to change not just your products and services, but also your IT and also the way you organize yourself. And seeing the rise of the chief digital officer, for instance, is a key part of that. And by the way, this just can't be a nice science experiment. It has got to, over time, deliver this demonstrable and sustainable economic value. So let me shift gears a little bit from the theoretical to the very real today. Something happened last quarter that banks have been talking about kind of fearfully for quite a long time, and that is that the Wall Street Journal reported that Amazon was thinking about opening up checking accounts with either J.P. Morgan Chase or with Capital One, both companies they've already got prior relationships with. What's interesting about this, and we could talk about this for the whole webinar, is that no one has ever met Amazon. And even if you want to try and get someone on the phone, I don't know if you've tried this, it is a really painful process. And when you finally get them, they're helpful. But we've all got a relationship with them, but we've never met them. And I would submit that banks have got a big advantage because you can actually meet a banker when you need to or talk to someone pretty easily on the phone. But let me also talk to you about why it is important for banks to become so much more digital. The expectations that customers have got of their banks are constantly being raised, and it's not by other banks. There's a company called Proper Cloth that basically lets you order a shirt that's essentially custom with measurements down to the quarter inch. Starbucks Order Ahead lets you pick up your drink and be in and out in 15 seconds if you time it properly. And Amazon Alexa is always on, and now they've started to add video to it so you can not only interact with it with your voice, you can go up there and touch it and scroll through things. And those are all examples of digital, but they're online, they're omni-channel, and they're by voice. So the observation I'd make is that bank peer groups, the ones they're being judged against today, are not just other banks. And that may or may not be fair, but it's just the reality, and we've all got to deal with that. And banks are starting to deal with this. We have been running a survey every couple of years starting in 2012, and we're going to launch our next one later this fall. And we asked banks what their top strategic priorities are. And in 2012 and 2014, they said that it was improving sales results. 2016, for the first time ever, improving customer experience rose to the fore, which we think is incredibly significant. 70% of banks said that was a top one or top two box priority for them. And sales results came down to number 3. There's been a realization, and it's being acted on now by people, that improving customer experience will, over time, lead to improved sales results, which we think is incredibly healthy. So another interesting example now of banks starting to move outside of traditional banking activities, and again, we think it's a really healthy development, is taking place in the car buying process. And J.P. Morgan and U.S. Bank and Bank of America have all announced initiatives that help consumers buy cars. And it's a fraught process, and you always feel as a consumer that you're being ripped off by the car salesman. The bank here will help you not just get a loan, but go out and find the car you want and then buy it for a price that you feel is fair. And, of course, they want to be there at the end with a pre-approved loan to do the lending to you, but they're going to get that and have it occur on a no-shop basis because they're helping you with all the upfront stuff. And we think this is just the beginning of a wave that can be applied to all sorts of things. Mortgages is obviously the next thing that comes to mind. So banking, and this is not necessarily a blindingly original observation, but banking is a means to an end for customers. It's not an end in itself. My kids don't say, oh, I'm going to go to the bank instead of the mall to hang out with my friends. Banking is something that you do to take care of the other stuff in your life that you really care about as a consumer. The challenge, though, is that banks, or at least many banks, persist in focusing on this notion of what is the next best offer for my customer? What can I sell to them next? When the reality is that there are not really that many times when a bank product is needed by a customer. So banks have got to move to a new way of thinking. They've got to move from reacting to a customer's express need, because customers often have to go to the bank and say, I think I need something like this. I've got some excess cash, or I need to buy a car because mine just died. They may not really know what's out there. Banks have got to move from being reactive to proactive and offering up suggestions when customers haven't even asked the question. Banks have often been very product-focused. And as I said, there are not that many times when a customer really needs a new banking product to move from product-focused to being focused on the financial health of your customers and move from that next best offer to the next best action. So it might be that I need some advice or some encouragement. I've just eaten at a restaurant only half the time in April that I did in March. Congratulate me on that. Let me know what a good job I've done. Give me those attaboys that make me feel much better about my financial life. So fundamentally, banks have got to move to a new mindset. They've got to move to generating win-win interactions with their customers. And when they do this, instead of a zero-sum game or an us versus them or heads you win, tails or you win, I lose, when they move to this win-win philosophy, they've got a chance to do better by their customer and also make more money. And with technology, they can now have all sorts of interactions that 10 years ago would not have been economically feasible to reach out and give this encouragement. But with technology, if it's set up right, you can have these low-cost, high-value interactions in a much more meaningful way and a much more cost-effective way than you ever could have before. So MoneyLion is a startup. Well, not a startup anymore. They've now got 2 million customers, but it's not a bank. It is very much app-based, and its focus is on improving consumers' financial health. And in fact, they won a Celent Model Bank of the Year award earlier this year in April. But what they do is really try to get consumers focused on better money habits. It uses gamification. It lets you introduce friends, and it goes beyond just savings to help you get a better handle on and understanding of your finances. One of the things that's really interesting is that they offer this membership program, and it's $29 a month. But if you check in once a day and flip through the 5 sliders that they have for you, which are tips and offers and the like, they will give you $1 back. And if you did this every day over the course of the year, you'd end up making 20 some odd bucks back from MoneyLion. Because what they are trying to do and what they're experimenting with is getting consumers to make checking in or interact with their finances an ongoing habit. And changing habits is really hard. This is their way of doing it by having it be a daily kind of thing where they will reward you in a very tangible way for engaging with your finances. And they will pull in data from all of your credit cards and all of your banks, give you a holistic picture. They will have the chance to underwrite you on a rolling basis so that if you say, hey, MoneyLion, I want the $500 loan that you're talking about at 5.99% interest, they will be able to underwrite you really, really quickly because they have a good picture of what is going on with your finances. And they offer encouragements and nudges and the like. Really an interesting take on this. And there's all sorts of experimentation going on. These guys, I'm sure, will be ready to pivot if something doesn't work the way they want it to, and they'll try something else. And they've got dozens and dozens of APIs so that they can connect third parties to their consumers. And there are a lot of other challengers who have entered the game. I won't go through each of those listed here, but they are all taking digital-first kinds of approaches, and in some cases digital only, to try and engage with consumers who want that kind of activity. But they're not alone. There are others who are coming from the incumbent space who are coming after the digital-first customers. So Marcus from Goldman Sachs, Citi announced this new national digital banking initiative to serve every state. Citizens had announced earlier this spring in May that they were going to launch Citizens Access. It just went live yesterday. PurePoint Financial is doing a hybrid deposit gathering strategy with digital first, but also some branches in a few select cities. And FinAI by Chase is just rolled out as well. Interestingly, they piloted it in the Midwest where they didn't have any branches. It was kind of we're going to burn the boats as we go explore the continent to make sure that we are fully committed. The customers who were piloting it could not go into a Chase branch. What was also interesting was that when Fin just on its own didn't work out so well, they changed it to Fin by Chase, suggesting the power of the brand in attracting digital customers. I talked about PurePoint briefly. Obviously, they've got some pretty attractive rates for consumers there, but their goal is attracting deposits, and they've done pretty well so far, but with branches backing this up. Going further afield, Development Bank of Singapore, DBS, created a new bank in India, Digibank. It is digital only. It's got a focused product set, but much of the interaction today is by text. And they've had 1.5 million customers since launch. And their conversational AI engine is good enough that only 18% of customer requests go to live chat sessions. The other way of looking at that, of course, is that 82% got answered by chat or by the AI. Now, it's a limited product set. They have got a digitally savvy customer base, and I'm pretty sure my mom would not be interacting with the digital AI. But they've done well enough that they are expanding. I'd also note that the AI vendor and Digibank in its incumbent businesses is not at 82%. It's more like 30 to 40% that get answered by AI. But still, that's a huge reduction in the load on the call center. So I think I've made the case for you that banks are being forced to up their game by digital-first competitors, but they have still got significant advantages. They've got brand, and we just saw how important that was. They've got branches. They've got customers already, and they've got data. And the data is really critical. When Google has built one of the most valuable countries in the world on the basis of inferred data, banks have all this explicit data, and they have not yet fully tapped into its potential. But ultimately, in a world of commoditized kinds of banking products, our view is that customer experience is the differentiating banking product. Focusing on that customer experience, both digital, where it can vary widely, but also to the call center and the ATM and the branch, all of that together differentiates your bank from its competition. And if that's the case, then there are some pretty profound implications. First, as I said before, move away from constantly selling. Instead, focus on trying to help the customer without that expectation of an immediate return. But if you can help them so that you get the no-call shopping when it is time to buy something, then you'll be in very good positions. Invest in the relationships. You can now have many more touch points delivered or manufactured at a much lower cost to serve than you could previously, and look to make those interactions mutually beneficial. What can you learn from those interactions? Can you mine what your customers are saying as they ask you questions? And third, focus on delivering that superior customer experience. And you know what? People will pay for good experiences. And, well, how do you pay for a good experience for a bank? Well, Quicken Loans is not competing out there on price. They are competing on customer experience. They're able to charge anywhere from 1/8 to 3/8 more on their loans, their mortgages, than their competitors because their customer experience is so great and so quick and so seamless. So how then do you actually make this customer experience the focal point of your business? Well, first of all, embrace the ecosystem. I talked about the dozens of APIs that MoneyLion has. Think about what partners can offer better or faster or cheaper than you that you couldn't do on your own. Look for those good partners and have some criteria in place so you aren't reinventing the wheel every time you go look for partners. And become a better partner yourself. I mean, the number of procurement horror stories that we've heard, and not just procurement, but also legal and risk and compliance, got to get that part figured out if you're going to be able to work with some of the nimbler fintechs out there who want to work with you, by the way. And do look for those customer win-wins. And ultimately, delivering that experience requires a deep empathy and understanding of your customers and the ability and willingness to provide the touch points that they want whenever and wherever and however they want them. So let me shift gears for a minute to customers and the branch. And we did a poll of 2,500 U.S. customers. We're pretty curious about their attitudes towards the branch. We did that earlier this year, so it's quite fresh data. And there are a lot of folks who are saying the branch is dead. We don't believe that. We believe the branch has a critical role, and I'll show you why. But it's got to be a role in the context of this overall relationship, including, very importantly, digital. And the punchline really is that folks don't need a branch that often, but when they do, they really do. And here's why. We asked people, if you had to have a conversation with a banker, how would you like to interact with them? 55% said, I want an in-person interaction. 39% said, I bank digitally, but prefer that some banking matters want to be handled in person. And 6% said, I just want digital interactions. Branches should be unnecessary. What about the mobile users, you might ask? Well, we broke that out, and it does not move all that significantly. In the middle, even the mobile banking users said, 53% of them said, I need some of these things, some of these interactions in person. We were also curious about, over the last 2 years, not the last 2 weeks, last 2 years, a much more significant time horizon than many polls we've seen, which ways have you interacted with your bank? And I'll go into a couple of highlights. First of all, visiting a branch to make a deposit, withdrawal, or other transaction on a non-ATM basis. 80% of folks who have done this in the last 2 years. Seeking information or getting advice or questions answered or originating an account, just over half, 53%. What about mobile, you say? Well, only 50% of customers have used a mobile device to bank in the last couple of years. And security is still a big issue. And these are very often profitable customers. But still, only half of the customer base out there has used mobile. And so the question becomes, how do you get them to use more mobile? How do you build that relationship with them? And how do you drive the customers who want the branch into mobile? So that's a subject for another day. But just be aware, not everyone, only half of them are using mobile today. What about the millennials, you might say? And sorry, there's a fourth button or bucket here that is the dark blue, that is 18 to 29. For the top one, it doesn't really change all that much. Branch behavior, branch visiting is still 75%, three-quarters, even for the younger cohorts. You think about computer and online. Computer, yeah, it skews a little bit older, but still, even the youngest, 64% have used a computer. On the mobile device, that's where the older cohorts aren't using mobile as much, and younger are using mobile device. But even so, 25% of that youngest group of 18 to 29 aren't using mobile for banking. Now, we were curious, if you're going to go in person, why are you doing that? And we divided it up into non-mobile, which is light blue, and the dark blue is mobile banking users. Well, they just preferred interacting with a banker in person, or they were more comfortable with interacting with a banker in person up top. Interestingly, lower down in this highlighting, my bank didn't offer the capability to do what I wanted digitally. 21% of the mobile users were forced into a branch because their digital point of connection didn't let them do what they wanted. So there's an area of opportunity for banks. And I'm certainly not in the youngest cohort here, but this kind of seemed easier to me. Thinking of your most recent branch interactions, why did you engage with a banker in person? Well, On the youngest, 42% of them said it just seemed a little bit easier. And I do want to go back for 1 second on this past 2 years interaction. I always like looking at the least popular answer and writing a letter. 1 or 2% of people still wrote a letter to interact with their banks, which I find kind of charming. And I'm sure that youngest group at that 1% writing a letter probably did that on an antique typewriter with nice bond paper and made it strongly worded. So we went from seeing easier, but technology is still really important. Why would the likelihood of changing banks based on your satisfaction? If you're dissatisfied with your self-service technology, you're much more likely to change banks than if you're satisfied. So you still got to get the technology right. Let's not sell that short. So what should you do? What does this really mean? Well, if you think about the customer experience, you've got to understand your customer, as I alluded to. So learn about them. Don't make them tell you. You've got all this stuff out there. You can go learn about them. And without being creepy, use that knowledge to serve them better. Compare them to others. People love kind of navel-gazing and being told how they look relative to others. Hey, you're saving more than your peer cohort. Good job, Dan. And at this stage, really focus on developing that segment of one. It sounds trite, but we've got the means now to do that in ways we couldn't have done 5 years ago. And on the next best action side, definitely got to be serving these up, but make sure that your actions and your requests are contextual. They're appropriate for the right time. And also just appropriate and relevant. Don't be sending me necessarily ads to go to American Eagle when you mean those to go to my kids. And make them easy and bite-sized, really nicely consumable. Make them helpful. Help the consumer when you're out there. And you can sell, but sell only when appropriate. If I just, on Amazon, to pick on them, well, the example is, I just bought a new toilet seat on Amazon. Stop advertising toilet seats. I only need one of those, I hope, and pretty infrequently. Just knock it off. And finally, use the right tone. Be authentic as you're communicating. And tone matters, particularly with millennials. And we see some of the newer, really innovative fintechs doing A/B testing on individual words and colors and screen positioning. But tone is critical. Determine what that is and what you want it to be. All of this, even though it's very technologically driven and driven by data and analytics, it requires empathy at the end of the day. And translating that empathy into actions is critical, even when all this is digital. Don't lose sight of the human. And finally, be willing to adapt. As Charles Darwin said, and this is not just a banking quote, it's a quote for every business. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And with that, thanks very much. You can follow me on Twitter up here or email me if you've got questions that we don't get to here. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Stevens of Quadient. Andrew, and David, I think you're going to take us through the transition.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say, Dan, that's a fascinating conversation. I just taking notes as quickly as I can. Some of the remarks that you made are some of the things that we've sort of heard, but to hear them, I think, crystallized very well. The idea in particular that stood out to me, the idea of from banks needing to move from the next best offer to the next best action, and just the importance of real engagement with the customer. And I know we're going to discuss in the Q&A some of the concerns around that, the concerns if banks feel that customers really do want to be closer to them. So I'm really looking forward to that, which is actually a great opportunity to remind everyone who's listening to the webinar today that we are going to be having an interactive Q&A, and that if you have any questions for Dan or for Andrew coming up in just a moment, please do share them with us using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those questions toward the end of our presentation. So with that, let me get out of the way and make room for Andrew Stevens, Banking and Financial Services Specialist with Quadient. Andrew, please take it away.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Dan. How do I follow all of that? Well, I want to deeper into the digital aspects of relationships and how you can have a good relationship with a customer that you never actually meet. And I'll try and use some practical examples along the way to give you some advice that you can take straight from this webinar and act on to help your customers to really fall in love with you. All in around about 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how fast I talk. So the first thing I need to do is really define the term relationship. And I tend to try and look beyond banking for my inspiration. So I went out to the Oxford English Dictionary. And this is the definition of relationship for them: the way in which two or more people or things are connected, or the state of being connected. And there's three versions of that: the state of being connected by blood or marriage, the way in which two or more people or groups regard and behave towards each other, and an emotional and sexual association between two people. For me, the second of these three options is the one that most closely resembles a customer's relationship with their financial institution. It's just about behaving a certain way towards each other. Having a relationship with a digital customer, though, it's quite hard. Distance relationships are always easier to break off than ones where you're face-to-face all the time. So the aim has to be to provide something that will help the customers to feel connected to you, as if by blood or marriage, the first of those options. If there's something stronger between you, breaking that relationship becomes so much harder. Just as an aside before I go on, if you're planning on going after that third definition of relationship there for your financial institution, good luck. My contract doesn't allow me to explain how you're best going about creating a sexual association with your customer, but the very, very best of luck for you. So how do we create a better relationship with our customers when we never meet them? Well, in preparation for this webinar, I spent a good amount of time looking at all the keywords that you find whenever you read sort of relationship websites on the internet. Goodness only knows what my wife will think if she ever looks at the internet history. But there are four main words or terms that almost always come up that I'd like to focus in on. The biggest one, as you'd expect, is love. We referred to it already today. But when we delve deeper, love in relationships comes from three other areas: understanding, mutual dependency, and consistency. So how can we translate these terms into something that enhances a customer's digital financial relationship with your organization to get them to love you, in effect? A common sense term, so let's see what we come up with. Let's start with understanding. How can we understand the customer? I can't even understand my wife at times. So how could a financial institution do this with millions of customers? Well, starting off is really easy, actually, because understanding is about having data to use. And you have a lot of data on your customers, as Dan's mentioned. There's probably more than you even know. If you've got officers or customers based in Europe, the amount of work that you've probably just done on GDPR for our friends in the European Parliament may have given you a good hint on just how much there is. I put a few of the high-level areas down there on the slide there just to start you off. I'm sure you could find 10 or 15 more areas within a few minutes of thinking. Now, taking this back to traditional relationships or personal relationships for a moment, probably more modern personal relationships. Back in mid-2017, a British journalist requested that Tinder, the popular dating app, sent her all the information it held on her. She got back over 800 pages. That seems a lot, but I would be surprised if you've got less than that from any customer that's got a long relationship with your organization, just from the transaction data that you've got, if you cross-reference it with your other sources. The difference between Tinder and financial institutions in this sense, though, is that Tinder knows how to use every piece of the data they've got to swipe right and to enhance that relationship the customer's got with them. Whereas in almost every financial institution I've ever spoken to or worked in, just a mention of the word data is met with that sort of quiet sigh that implies a world of missed potential, an understanding that there's gold hidden in the hills, but you're missing the picks and shovels to get at it. So how do you find those tools and get at the gold? Well, the usual recommended approach from financial institutions and consultants really is to wheel out good old phrases like big data and data lake, which does very little other than to suggest that whatever they're recommending is likely to cost well into 8 figures and take years to implement with all of those security requirements that you've got. I know it did when I was sat where you are now, and it was recommended to me. And that's made even more frustrating when you know that a good percentage of your data isn't actually accurate anyway, or it's not synchronized at the same time, or even that it's the same but held in different formats on different systems. So my recommendation is that unless you actually have big data systems within your organization and you know how to use them really well right now, don't worry about installing them straight away. They're not quite as prevalent as you think anyway. A couple of quotes for you. Big data will spell the death of customer segmentation and force the marketer to understand each customer as an individual within 18 months or risk being left in the dust. That's the chair, president, and CEO of IBM. Powerful stuff from a really important person. But it was said 65 months ago. We're working on it, but nowhere near as fast as expected. The quote I prefer, much more realistic. It's the famous one from Dan Ariely. I'll leave you to read through it, but well, if the message is that we shouldn't worry about the long-term fix, what should we do instead to create Dan's segment of one that he's talked about? Well, what do you actually need? You need to know that the data you're using is accurate, and you need to be able to pull that data from multiple locations at once in order to make a decision on something. So find yourself a product that can do that. You're looking for the ability to quickly pull data from multiple sources, the ability to pull data that may not quite be complete or exactly match your search criteria, and the ability to make a decision on which data may be connected and which may not, so that you can recommend how to clean up the data that is pulled. If you can do that, you can truly harness all of your data and make sure that it's accurate at the same time. You don't need to configure it to pull the data from every source you have every single time. You can install it to pull from different places depending on what your business processes are, which will make it so much easier on you to implement nice and quickly. So now you've got lots of data you can use to understand your customer. Well, that's great. But if you're one of those people like me that you know your wedding anniversary date, but you've forgotten it when it mattered, i.e. on the day you were supposed to have a present ready, you'll know that understanding something and acting on it successfully can be completely different things. If that's the case, how do we act on our data in ways that will make the customer feel that they've got a good relationship with us? Well, that cuts to the heart of the second of the items on my list, mutual dependency. We need to act on the data in a way that creates something for both sides. And here I mean real benefit for both sides, not a benefit for your organization and a well-worded marketing pitch to pretend there's a benefit for the customer. I've lost track of the number of turn off your paper statements to help save the trees marketing campaigns that I've seen that failed to meet their targets because the customers realized that the only benefit was that the bank saved on the print and postage costs, and the customer didn't really understand any value to them. So what are the actions we can take? Well, firstly, we need to think back to what really drives relationships. What makes people feel special? And it's not actually the one-off big things. They're really nice, but they're usually expensive and very, very rare. It's the lot of little things that go into making someone feel that they're valued and they're cared about. So focus on those. Take the information you have about your customers and work out what little things they may like to see improved based on that data. And going back to my example of switching off paper statements, there are numerous little improvements you could make based off that data that could show the customer that they're receiving value from a digital statement as well. How about taking your dull PDFs, making them interactive by adding links to offers that are based on the customer's circumstances, or creating a fully interactive statement that allows the customer to search, to sort, to filter their transactions. Maybe perfect for a rapidly expanding business that needs to do something with that statement, like checking that all of their standing orders or direct debits have been paid in time. Maybe you could offer a statement that allows the customer to make and to store annotations, so they can add in the information you aren't able to provide for their own benefit. And don't forget, you can always take those annotations and use them to understand the customer even better in future. Or one step further than all of that, and provide all of the customer's transactions across all of their accounts on a single statement, and let them filter and arrange them however they want, so that they can see their entire account status with you in one communication. None of those examples necessarily require massive pieces of work. They're certainly not the sort of thing that requires a formal transformation program to deliver. And if you keep delivering these little incremental benefits alongside those one-off big hits in your transformation program, and you know they're useful to the customer because you've got the data to show it, you're guaranteed to keep the customer interested. If you keep the customer interested, they're much more likely to invest in you as an organization and less likely to start looking around when they've got those other financial needs to fulfill. Give a little, you take a little. That sounds like a good relationship. But remember, base those changes around what the customer actually needs and wants. Not necessarily what you think may be simple. Be led by your customer at all times, not necessarily by what your IT team says is cheap to do. So what's the last one we need to cover? Consistency, yes. So what's consistency useful for? Well, in a person-to-person relationship, it's about knowing what to expect. Those little surprises are great, but you have to have something you can trust as a basis for what to expect when you're dealing with that person. You're not going to come home and find that they look massively different or that they no longer speak your language. How do we translate that into a digital financial relationship? Well, for me, there's a little there about branding, but it's actually more about the consistency of your messaging, the consistency of your understanding, to go back to my first point, and the consistency across all of your other channels as well. You may not want, and the customer may not want anything other than to be a digital self-serving customer. But there may be times that, as Dan's mentioned, when they want or need to switch channels. That could be as simple as switching between internet pages and a mobile application, or it could be something more involved, like actually going into a branch. I'm a fully digital customer, but just like Dan's stats show, when I took out my last mortgage, I wanted to visit a branch, despite being able to get an entire mortgage online in a day without ever speaking to anyone with my bank. It was just more comforting to talk to a human when I made a big purchase. So if it's about messaging and consistency of understanding, what are we talking about here? Well, it's that classic phrase in its purest sense, the one that Dan touched upon right at the start of his talk, the omni-channel experience. Despite us talking digital here, though, it's not just about what I'm hearing more and more about these days, the digital omni-channel experience, which is an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. It's about making sure that your messaging and your understanding is consistent across every single channel that you have. If that sounds suddenly like I'm breaking my promise of giving you practical advice that you can take away directly from this webinar, bear with me for a second. I know that the transformational journey is a long one and it's really quite difficult. So I'm not going to focus on that today. What I want to focus on for the consistency part of this talk is how you guarantee your consistency eventually. Not assume that you're going to get it right away with a simple one-step billion-dollar transformation that magically only takes a month to complete. You see, the omni-channel experience seems like an unachievable holy grail to many people simply because of the method of execution within most financial institutions. They know where they want to go, but getting there is proving really tricky because of one simple phrase: digital first. I want to be really clear before everyone gets a little confused here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the digital first message per se. The problem comes when the digital first message gets interpreted as digital only. And in many banks, certainly, this is causing real concerns for the overall omni-channel endgame. The reason is that omni-channel experiences are all about breaking down the silos to give that consistency of messaging and understanding. But by focusing on the execution of the digital channel before you've thought about the longer term plan, or perhaps you've thought about it in terms of, we'll deal with that later, you end up actually just building a silo with even higher walls than before, all the while trying to convince yourself by building up that digital channel, you're breaking down silos. It's where the digital omni-channel experience phrase comes from. People focusing on digital to the detriment of everything else, and then trying to shout loudly that the omni-channel term is still valid just by redefining it. In reality, they mean something along the lines of, you can get the same experience on your internet and mobile channels, but we've not thought about any of the traditional channels or any of the customer experience outside of our little world. That in itself creates a really odd and dangerous scenario, where at some point in the future, one of the very senior executives at these organizations is going to take a look at the digital platform and say, that is amazing. Now port it to the staff channel. Or I want all of our customer communications to look like this. And whoever's been standing proudly at the front of the room presenting to those executives is suddenly going to have to explain just how much that's going to cost, because they're going to have to start from scratch with a different platform. I know I wouldn't want to be there giving that message. So if you want consistency across your platforms, so your messaging is the same, take a step back before you lurch into that digital-first strategy and make sure you're not thinking digital only. If you are, think about how you're going to impact your relationship with your customer, because even if they're digital first, they aren't necessarily digital only. Once you've done that, take a look at the market and ask all of those potential suppliers that you've got if they really are omni-channel or if they're digital focused. Can they easily transpose the functionality to your staff channels, whether that's in branch, on the telephone, in the front or back office, anywhere really? Or are they stretching now? Are they trying to persuade you that actually only the digital channels matter? And what are they going to do about all those customer communications? Do you have to rebuild everything in the new digital silo and manage them twice? Once in the digital world and again for everyone else in that old-fashioned world? How does that impact on your ideal operating model as an organization? Do you get the widespread transformation you were hoping for, or just for one silo? Once you're happy that you're buying a software solution that can give a truly omni-channel experience, you can focus on your digital channels first. But you'll know that when it comes time to spread that message out to the other channels, you'll have that consistency that you need for your customer relationship. So I guess to summarize, relationships are hard work. Digital financial relationships or personal relationships. And they're even harder when you're in a long-distance relationship. But you can make them work by breaking down the real-world understanding of relationships and building them back up again in pure financial services terms. So by understanding your customer through the data that you hold on them, by creating a level of mutual dependency, by taking that data and delivering small but valuable customer-led innovations that show that you care, and by being consistent in the message and the understanding to your understanding of the customer through starting an omni-channel journey that goes beyond digital, even for your digital customers. If all of that sounds great, but you need to know a little bit more about how to deliver it all, we've got good news for you. At Quadient, we care passionately about these things. We spent years perfecting our software to help you create truly omni-channel consistent messages based on your data to dramatically improve the experience that your customers have with your organization. Our award-winning product suite's on screen now for you. If you're interested in knowing more, though, please take a look at our website. It's www.quadient.com, and then give us a call. We'd love to help you to make sure that you've got the tools to really make a difference in your relationships. And I particularly like to call out the Inspired Digital Advantage suite there up towards the top right. It's released only a couple of months ago for our 12 release, and it's going to be critical not only in helping you to revolutionize your functionality to give you a better digital relationship with your customer in some of the ways that I've discussed, but it'll also revolutionize your operating model by putting the content safely in the hands of business users and bringing your IT costs down really quite dramatically. And with that, I'll say thank you ever so much for listening to me, and may all your relationships with your customers be long and fruitful. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Very good and very interesting points from you as well. Particularly, I like the line, the idea of being led by your customers at all times is the kind of thing that you can almost never go wrong if that's your mantra. Again, we've got some questions coming in from the folks who've been listening, and some really interesting questions here. We don't have a ton of time, but we definitely can touch on a few of these before we have to wrap up. And the first one was really kind of an interesting one. And it touches back to a point that Dan made earlier, and it was the idea of an example of how an FI would apply empathy to the data and analytics proposition. And Dan, let's give that one to you.
Sure. Well, thanks, David, and really interesting question. I think that there are a lot of different layers to it, and one is just first of all having the empathetic mindset to begin with. and then once you've got that, flowing it through to different situations. And so, part of it might be, just off the top of my head, you think about guidelines for people who are in distress. Either they're bereaved because they've just lost a loved one, or maybe they lost their job, but they've been steadily employed for quite a long time. There are two parts of it. One is the empathy and policy question. How are we going to deal with this? Are we going to make an offer to someone who's just lost their spouse, or tell them we're here for them if they've got some special needs, or we can. I haven't fully thought through that. Or if someone's lost a job, give them, and I'm sure this will make a lot of traditional bankers a little squeamish, but give a month or two of mortgage deferral as they get their feet back under them, just because you've had a long time relationship. And so that's kind of the policy decision. On the data and analytics side, there are all sorts of potential ways to figure that out. I mean, perhaps you are scouring the local obituaries, and again, this may get into creepiness, but or you have gotten notice they stopped getting their paycheck, and you notice this thing going on, and you make an inquiry. So I think it's a tough question. I don't have the exact answers, but that kind of philosophy is kind of where my head would go. Can you reach out and offer a hand up rather than start to, after the paychecks stop coming and after the mortgage payments a couple of months later start getting missed? Can you have headed that off earlier on in a way that makes you a partner and will earn you a grateful customer for life?
Interesting. I wonder, Andrew, if you have any thoughts on that matter, given the way you sort of put us more in touch with our emotional side and finance with your presentation.
Yeah, actually, the fourth item that I would have included if I'd have had time on my side of things was common sense. And really, to an extent, empathy can be common sense. You don't necessarily need a huge amount of data and highly complex AI trying to replicate human beings. You need to think like a customer and say, well, what would I want in that scenario? So if I've got the data and as Dan said, that situation where I've suddenly seen my income drop, what would I want the bank to do? And that can be quite a simple business rule. It can be as complex as you analyze every single piece of data you've got with them across the organization, or as simple as the income coming in this month has dropped. I will put that out to an operator to maybe give them a call and find out if there's anything that we can do with a list of ideas that can go there. And though that list, again, could be based off business rules, off procedures that have been put in place. It doesn't necessarily have to be the most complicated solution in the world on day one. Once you've found out what's working and what isn't, then you can move up to those larger and more complicated solutions.
Certainly. It's really interesting. As you might imagine, it's a topic, your empathy and banking, that's much more to it than might seem at first glance. The points that you've made with regard to common sense, to really being in touch, engage with your customers, all the way up to some of the more complicated and more technologically involved solutions. I recall a company at a Finovate show not too long ago that was able to use a variety of behavioral techniques to adjust marketing messages, both the images used, the language used, the colors used, based on an assessment of personality types, to try to help financial institutions better craft messages that are going to be more effective to certain sorts of people based on the type of person that they are. So there's so much, I think, that can be talked about and learned from this area. And again, touching on the point that you said, because of that relationship that banks have with customers. There was another question that I think that applies to both of the components of the conversation that you both had, and this has to do quite simply with who's out there doing it right. Who do you think, in terms of the digital banking proposition, has really managed to square that circle in some of the ways that you've both discussed?
Well, I can take a first crack at that, and I think
Sure.
My first observation would be that this is an ongoing and moving target. So it's a journey. It's not a destination, and the goalpost wall is being moving. Sorry, I'm tossing in lots of different metaphors there. But folks who are doing some really nice movement on this and continue to evolve and experiment. USAA comes to mind with their relentless customer focus and their dispersed customer base. So they've been remote for a long, long time. I think B of A is doing really interesting things. Erica is a really nice experiment, and I think one of the challenges of conversational AI is that sometimes it has overpromised and not delivered on those promises, but it's a step in the right direction and continues to evolve. RBC in Canada is doing some interesting things with educating customers in microbursts and gamifying that learning, and they're also doing it with their employees. TD Bank, what's interesting there is that they have partnered with Moven to kind of outsource a lot of their customer experience generation, but they work closely in a partnership. So those are a few. Looking at a smaller bank, ATB, Alberta Treasury in Alberta, Canada, is working with a smaller conversational AI company to really punch above its weight in enhancing the customer experience. So I think there are all sorts of interesting folks out there. I think the challenge for smaller institutions is that the big folks have hundreds of developers and large budgets, and the clear implication for the smaller folks is that they can't do this on their own. They've got to go out and find the right partners to help them do it. The good news is there are all sorts of partners out there who want to be on the other end of that transaction.
Absolutely. And we don't have a great deal of time left. I wonder, Andrew, if you have a few institutions who you might sort of put on your highlight list in that regard as well.
Yeah, I'd actually be slightly harsher, I guess, than Dan in that saying I don't think anyone's got it right yet. Unless you are a brand new startup digital challenger bank where, to be honest, you're cheating to an extent because you've been able to pick digital customers in the first place, and you know that everyone's fine with it. You're in an environment where you've got customers of all ages, of all levels of digital maturity, and no one's really cracked that game yet. Even the leading banks that Dan's mentioned, people like Bank of America, who are absolutely superb at what they're doing. I think that I used to say it was a race to the start line. I think those sorts of banks are off the start line now. But there's nobody who's sat there saying, yeah, we finished, we won. There's still an enormous amount of work to be done, and there's still a lot of opportunity for people to overtake anyone that just takes a step back and takes their foot off the gas, if it were.
Excellent. Well, that's something for us all then to be looking for who are watching the space. I want to thank both of our guests, Dan and Andrew, for participating in our webinar today. That's all the time we have for I'm afraid. If you have any feedback on today's webinar or any recommendations for future webinars you'd like us to have, please do complete our short survey at the end of this webinar. It should flash up on your screen in just a moment. You'll also shortly receive an email with a recording of this webinar for you to review, and we will also include in that email an exclusive 10% discount for Finovate Fall, which is coming up September 24th through the 27th this year, this fall, in New York City. So again, thank you on behalf of Finovate and behalf of Dan and Andrew. Thanks for attending, and we'll talk to you next time.